Hello and welcome to Lecture 6, Scale Economies, Imperfect Competition, and Trade. Up to this point, as we've been discussing comparative advantage, we've looked at countries and how countries should trade to exploit the relative cost differences that arise from differences in factor endowments. So, for example, industrialized countries will typically trade with developing countries. In our examples in previous lectures, we've looked at the US with the production of wheat versus other countries with the production of cloth and different factor endowments between nations. Part of this comparative advantage theory doesn't conform to reality because we see industrialized nations trading with industrialized nations. The theory suggests that that shouldn't happen. So why does that happen? That's what we're going to be discussing today in Lecture 6, Scale Economies, Imperfect Competition, and Trade. And these are, imperfect competition is a reason why we see things maybe not conforming to the theory. So let's jump into it. First, we'll discuss scale economies and what that means. So first, we'll discuss constant returns to scale. Constant returns to scale are when input use and total cost rise in the same proportion as output increases. Because total cost and output go up by the same proportion, average cost, or cost divided by the number of units produced, is constant or steady. So what we're saying is for an increase, if you increase your output, the cost per unit will stay the same. So your costs go up by the same amount that your output goes up. And so it's proportion, it's constant. We call this constant returns to scale. In the real world, we typically will see what we call scale economies, or you may have heard it, economies of scale. With scale economies, output quantity goes up by a larger proportion than does total cost as output increases. So if output quantity expands faster than total cost increases, the average cost of producing a unit of output decreases as output increases. What we're saying here is, as we increase the amount of this product that we're producing, the costs, the total costs are not going up as quickly as our output. So I'll give you an example. Maybe you've got fixed costs and variable costs. So you've built a factory, and that factory, you have to pay for it no matter what. Let's say you have to pay, $20,000 a month for that factory. But then you've got variable costs that go into the product you're producing. Well, the more products you produce, the more you can spread out the cost of your fixed costs. Fixed costs will remain the same, a fixed amount. And if you can spread that out over more units, then the overall cost per unit comes down. So this is where we have imperfect competition, because some companies, some countries have better scale economies. They're able to produce more, which means that they're able to bring down the average cost. So they have an advantage there. Here's a chart illustrating what we're talking about. So we've got the cost per unit, and you can see as we're producing 25,000, the total cost is 650,000, but the average cost per unit is $26. The more we make, you can see the average cost comes down. Now, so when we make twice as much, the total cost is not twice as much. And so our average cost per unit goes down to $23. We get to 75,000, and you can see our average cost per unit is 21. And then we get to 100,000. At that, our average cost is $20 per unit. So scale economies exist for the range of production up to 100,000 in this example. So you can see the cost per unit comes down, comes down, comes down. But once we hit 100,000, it doesn't continue to decline as much. So average cost is declining as output increases in this range. Next, let's discuss internal economies of scale. In internal economies of scale, the size of the individual firm matters. So the larger firms have a cost advantage over smaller firms. Scale economies that are internal to the firm can drive an industry away from perfect competition because they drive individual firms to be larger than the very small firms that populate perfectly competitive industries. So perfectly competitive industries would tend to have a lot of small firms, but when we see imperfect competition, it induces or drives individual firms to become larger so they can take advantage of the scale economies that we've been discussing. So if scale economies are modest or moderate, there's room in the industry for a large number of firms. So if there's not a lot of opportunity for economies of scale and reducing the cost per unit, then there is room in an industry for a large number of firms. So for products that are differentiated, a mild form of imperfect competition called monopolistic competition exists, where a large number of firms compete vigorously with each other in producing and selling varieties of the basic product. So if a few large firms dominate the global industry, perhaps this is because of substantial scale economies, then we have what we call an oligopoly. So monopolistic competition versus oligopoly. In this case up here, we see a lot of firms, and down here we see just a few large firms. And that is because there's likely a substantial amount of scale economies. So we've just discussed internal, now let's discuss external scale economies. External scale economies are based on the size of an entire industry within a specific geographic area. So let's say within the United States. So it's the entire industry. The average cost of the typical firm producing the product in this area declines as the output of the industry, so all the local firms producing this product within the area, is larger. So before we were talking about just within the company, now we're talking about an entire industry, looking at external scale economies. So here are some types of external economies of scale. We've got clustering of the production of some products in specific geographic areas due to a specialized supply of resources such as labor, equipment, and support services. So you look at the glory days of Detroit, a lot of cars were being manufactured there, not just by, say, Ford, but other car manufacturers. That's because there was a type of external economies of scale due to this clustering effect and the specialized supply of resources. Also, there's greater knowledge spillover among the firms in the cluster. So we see that, for instance, in the San Francisco Bay Area, Silicon Valley, there's a lot of knowledge spillover amongst the firms there as we see clustering happen and external economies of scale occurring within the industries there. Now let's discuss an important topic here called intra-industry trade. First, we're going to have a few definitions and discuss how this relates to what we're just talking about for this lecture. The first is net trade. Net trade for an industry is the difference between exports and imports of the industry's products. Then we've got inter-industry trade. A country exports products in some industries and imports products in other industries. So for each industry, net trade is either almost all exports or almost all imports. And finally, we have intra-industry trade, IIT. This is two-way trade in which a country both exports and imports the same or very similar products. So products in the same industry. So how do we measure intra-industry trade? We'll discuss how to measure it, and then we'll discuss why it might be important. So IIT is the part of total trade in the product, exports plus imports, that is not net trade. So you remember net trade is the difference between exports and imports of the industry, whereas IIT is the part of total trade. So total trade is exports plus imports, that is not net trade. So here's the formula. IIT equals X plus M minus the absolute value of X minus M. So X is the value of exports, and M is the value of imports of the product. So for intra-industry trade for a product is equivalent to twice the value of the smaller of exports or imports. So we'll look at this formula, and we'll look at how we can calculate intra-industry trade, and then we'll discuss why it might be important. So the relative importance of IIT as a share of total trade, so how much of our trade is intra-industry trade, can be expressed in this formula. So our IIT share, intra-industry trade, as a share of our total trade, the formula is IIT over total trade. Total trade is X plus M. IIT is X plus M minus the absolute value of X minus M. So we can simplify this to 1 minus the absolute value of X minus M over X plus M. IIT is more important for trade in manufactured products than it is for trade in agricultural products. So let's take a look. Here are different products. This is the intra-industry trade for the United States, and we've got a few products from 2012. So let's just look at the first one here, perfumes. So total exports was 1,723. So that's our X. Total imports, M, is 1,962. So to get our total trade, we're going to add these two together. It gives us 3,684. You can see there's some rounding error, but that's close enough for what we're trying to illustrate. So total trade is X plus M. Net trade, you'll remember, is X minus M. So we've got more imports coming in than exports. So we've got a negative 239 for our net trade. It's 1723 minus 1962 gives us negative 239. Okay, so our intra-industry trade, you'll remember, is total trade minus the absolute value of net trade. So if we take this minus 239, we'll get our intra-industry trade, which is 3,445. So what share of our total trade is our intra-industry trade? We'd take this and divide it by this, take intra-industry trade, IIT, divided by total trade, and it gives us 93.5%. So of total trade, total trade in perfumes, 93.5% of it is intra-industry trade. So a significant amount of intra-industry trade. And you can see these cosmetics, it's 90%, clothes washing machines, microcircuits, automobiles, books and brochures, photographic cameras. So these all have a large amount. Okay, so now we're going to look at it, the percentage share of industry trade in the country's total trade in non-food manufactured products. So we're looking at non-agriculture, non-food manufactured products. So here's the country. We've got United States, Canada, Japan, Germany, France, and United Kingdom. And we've got 3 different years that we're going to compare. So we can see trends starting in 1989 going to 2012. So you can see United States as a share of our total trade, intra-industry trade represented 55.3% in 1989. It's grown to 63.6%. Canada, you can see it went up and then down. So we're about where we started in 1989. Japan is significantly higher. Germany's remained fairly flat. as has France, United Kingdom as well. So United States, we've seen an increase. Japan, we've seen a significant increase over time. So what explains intra-industry trade? You'll remember we talked about how these are trades where the same or similar products are being traded. So why is that? Why is that happening? If you have ever listened to a comedian by the name of Brian Regan, he does a skit about logs, and he sees two trucks hauling logs going opposite directions, and he suggests, well, why wouldn't they just call each other up and let them know that that they've got logs and that they don't have to ship them. There are differences though. So, and we'll talk about this. So some measured IIT reflects trade driven by comparative advantage. And, but when we're looking at this, we need to discuss the concept of product differentiation. So there are many different types and varieties of a product, and automobiles might be a great example. For a number of years, U.S. cars, and I'm not trying to be negative about the U.S. car industry because they make some good cars, but it was kind of the opinion of many that maybe some of these foreign cars, like a Honda or a Toyota, make a little bit better car. And so while we are able to manufacture many cars here, importing from Japan or Korea, that happened because of product differentiation. Also, intra-industry trade can happen, and some things we need to be aware of are transportation costs and geographical locations. Now let's discuss monopolistic competition in trade. So monopolistic competition describes an industry with the following characteristics. A large number of firms, each producing a variant of a product that consumers view as unique. The product differentiation may be based on branding, physical characteristics, quality, effectiveness, or anything else that matters to consumers. Each firm has some degree of monopoly power based on its established production of its unique variety. There is ease of entry and exit of firms in the long run. So that is monopolistic competition. Now let's look at a monopolistically competitive market with no international trade. So the three characteristics of a monopolistically competitive market for small compact cars with no trade in the US are, first, differentiation. So we're talking again, no trade, there's no international trade here. Differentiation, the price that a firm can charge decreases as the number of models available in the market increases. So that makes sense. The more competition there is, the more alternatives that people have, it would drive down the overall price. So the price curve, P, is downward sloping. We'll look at a curve here in just a second. Internal scale economies. Crowding of models reduces the ability for the firm to achieve scale economies. So the unit cost curve is upward sloping. We'll look at that. So again, this is because we can't get scale economies because there's too much crowding and we can't get enough to get scale economies. Also, ease of entry and exit from the market. In the long run, a typical firm earns zero economic profits on its model. Okay, so here is the US market for compact cars with no trade. So you can see our y-axis, price and cost per car, and our x-axis are the number of models available. So we're assuming here that there are 10 different compact car models available, and we've got the price. The more number of models we have, that price curve is sloping downward, so the price decreases the more models there are. And here's the unit cost. The unit cost is going up the more number of models are available because we're unable to achieve scale economies. So here is our equilibrium price for the car right here at 19. So this is with no trade. So let's open it up to free trade now. So if the world is now open to trade, first, domestic automobile company, for example, Ford, can export their models to foreign consumers. So let's say it's open now. Now Ford can export their models to foreign consumers. Foreign automakers in the rest of the world can export their models to the United States. So what we had here before, this is the upper part of this figure shows us no trade with the national markets. So here's the United States, just as we saw before, our price was 19 when we had 10 models available. The rest of the world, their price was 18 and a half, and they had 12 models available from different manufacturers. So it's a similar structure here where we have a decreasing price, the more models available. So because the rest of the world had 12 models available, you can see the price is a little bit lower at 18 and a half. So when we open up trade, we've got a free trade equilibrium for the world. So because we have a higher number of models available now, you can see that we're farther down this price curve. And so the overall price of each automobile is less at 17. So let's look at the basis for trade. In this setting, the basis for trade is product differentiation. So consumers might prefer styling of one car over the other or other things. The basis for exporting is the domestic production of unique models for foreign consumers. So foreign consumers would be interested in buying a unique model from the US. The basis for importing into the US is the demand by domestic customers for unique models produced by foreign firms. So if you prefer the styling of BMW or Mercedes, you'll be more likely to purchase those if those can be imported into the US. So intra-industry trade in differentiated products can be large, even between countries that are similar in their general production structure. So this shows us net trade and intra-industry trade between the US and the rest of the world. Up top here, we've got wheat. So we are a net exporter of wheat, exporting $40 billion worth of wheat to the rest of the world in this diagram. Down here, we're exporting compact cars, about $30 billion worth of compact cars to the rest of the world as they import it. But the rest of the world will export about $70 billion worth of compact cars back to the United States. And so with these, we can calculate our net trade and our intra-industry trade, as we've discussed previously. So what are the gains from this trade? A major additional source of national gains from trade is the increase in the number of varieties of products available to consumers through imports. And another source of gains from trade arises from increased competition between domestic and foreign firms and lower prices of domestic varieties. So when we see this competition, prices will decrease, and so consumers will win. They've got higher variety to pick from, and costs are lower. So those are the gains from trade. So unlike the HO model, the opening up of trade has little impact on the domestic distribution of factor incomes if the additional trade is intra-industry. So we're not seeing factors move from the car industry to, say, cloth in this scenario. So those factors don't move. We're just now exporting some additional vehicles. Gains from greater variety can offset any losses in factor income resulting from inter-industry shifts in production that do occur. So we might see some inter-industry shifts, but the gains from a greater variety of that product can offset any losses in our factor income. Now let's jump to global oligopoly. In an oligopoly market, a small number of firms dominate total production of a product, and oil might be a great example. Um, Here's a good example. The airplane manufacturing, Boeing and Airbus account for nearly all the world's production of large commercial aircraft. Sony, Nintendo, and Microsoft design and sell most of the world's video game consoles. And CVRD, Rio Tinto, and BHP Billiton mine more than half of the world's iron ore. So we're talking just a few firms, a small number of firms that dominate total production, a huge, huge amount. So what about oligopolies, scale economies, and trade? If substantial scale economies exist over a large range of output, then production of a product tends to be concentrated in a few large facilities in a few countries to take advantage of the cost reducing benefits of scale economies. So with these, where there's a significant opportunity for scale economies, we'll see them kind of concentrated into just a few companies or countries. So countries that have these production locations export the product, the Middle East with oil, for instance. Other countries import the product. So what about oligopoly pricing? How do they do pricing? Well, each firm in an oligopoly is competing with only a few other large firms. So any action it takes will provoke reaction from rivals. So if they lower prices, then the rivals will also have to lower prices. And we can look at the prisoner's dilemma and cartels to show us what effects may happen within oligopolies. But if the oligopoly firms can restrain their price rivalry, so if they can stop from getting into a price war, then the exporting countries benefit from the higher export prices and better terms of trade. Just recently, we've seen a bit of a price war between the Middle East and Russia on oil, and that drove down the price of oil because of a price war there. Now let's look at external scale economies. External scale economies, which are also called agglomeration economies. They exist when the expansion of the entire industry's production within a geographic area lowers the long-run average cost for each firm in the industry in the area. So we're talking about an entire industry is benefiting from lower average costs because of external scale economies. Production tends to be concentrated in a small number of locations, and countries with these locations export the product. So let's look at external economies and the expansion in a competitive industry. So this is an example of semiconductors. We've got our original supply. S1 is the sum of individual firm supply curves, which do not include external economies. So this is before external economies. You can see here, this is the industry's average cost, including external economies. So the more that is manufactured, the more scale economies there are, external scale economies. So the price per unit goes down. So when we see this, we can see that there's a shift in the industry. Along this curve, you can see we hit letter C here. So before we saw these external economies of scale, the price was at $19, but as they manufacture more, they're manufacturing 60 over 40, we can see the price drops to 14. So in industries that can reap external economies, this might be from knowledge spillovers from firm to firm, a rise in demand also triggers a great expansion of supply and lowers costs and price. Therefore, increasing trade brings gains to all consumers, home country and foreign country alike, as well as to the exporting producers. This concludes our lecture of Chapter 6, Scale Economies, Imperfect Competition, and Trade. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me during my office hours. If those times don't work for you, shoot me an email and we'll figure out another time to meet. Thank you very much.